Hey, I'm assuming you're here because you want to watch me build this. I actually did this build back in the summer of 2019, but it wasn't until COVID hit that I had time to edit all this footage together. I want to state up front that I am not a professional and I barely know what I'm doing. I'm just figuring out everything as I go along and I'm probably making a bunch of mistakes. This isn't a tutorial video and you're not going to learn anything here. I'm just documenting my experience. Anyway, enough about me, let's jump to the build. My first step was to whiteboard everything. I had some key considerations I wanted to take into account when I was doing the design, things such as the weight. To keep the weight down, I decided to use two different sizes of plywood. I would use 3/4 inch plywood on the walls and then 1/2 inch on the front and back. My goal was to be able to lift the cabinet with just 2 people. The overall size. To save money, I only wanted to buy 2 pieces of 8x4 foot plywood, but this meant that there was a limit to how big the cabinet could be overall. I wanted to include a mini fridge. I saw someone else build one of these online and they had a mini fridge in theirs and I knew I just had to steal that idea. I need to consider proportions. How high should the control board be? How far should it stick out? I checked out some arcade machines in my area to get a sense of proper dimensions. I want to install casters so that I can roll it around pretty easily. You get it. For the display, instead of using a Raspberry Pi or another PC, I wanted to use an all-in-one computer that I already had on hand. This all-in-one was also a touchscreen, and I thought that would be kind of cool. When designing the cabinet, I needed to decide which parts of the machine would need to be glued and which parts would be screwed. This helped me decide which materials to buy. Finally, the cost. I was willing to put some money into the machine, but ultimately I wanted to save wherever I could. Now that the whiteboarding was done, I was ready to start the build. Since the whole machine would be built around the mini fridge, I needed to have accurate measurements of the fridge before I could start making any cuts. Lucky for me, the fridge I ordered online arrived early, so I can get accurate measurements and I didn't have to rely on the information I found online. Now that I knew the final dimensions of the fridge, I was ready to start making some cuts. I needed to first cut the 3/4 inch plywood down to 6 feet and then cut straight down the middle to get 2 equal pieces of 2 feet each. Since I was too cheap to buy more than 2 sawhorses, I decided to lay the sheets onto some scrap wood and then make the cuts on the floor. To make the base of the machine, I needed to first make a box out of 2x4s. I would then attach a piece of plywood for the fridge to sit on and I could later screw the casters into the 2x4s. After talking to my girlfriend's dad, he had recommended that I join the wood together using something called a lap joint. I had never done one before, but after watching some tutorials online, I decided to give it a try. It came out okay. Now that I had the base, I could use it as a guideline for where I should make my other cuts. I did the same with the all-in-one by estimating the ideal viewing angle. I then drew the remaining lines onto the plywood. I made a lot of mistakes during this process, but ultimately I was able to get my sketch in place. Just ignore all these squiggled out lines. I was really nervous about making these next cuts because I don't have much experience with a jigsaw. Originally, I wanted to clamp both pieces of plywood together and then cut them at the same time, but my saw blade did not cut deep enough to do so. Instead, I needed to cut one piece first and then use it as a template for the other piece. I found a website online that sells T-molding that I thought would look great going up the sides of the machine, but after considering the cost of the T-molding and a router bit I would have had to buy, I decided to just round the corners with a palm router instead. I didn't have much experience with the palm router either, but after doing a few tests on some scrap wood, I was ready for the real thing. It's a pretty fun tool to use, but I should probably have had a ventilation mask on for this part. It was around this time we were hit with a giant heat wave in southern Ontario and I could no longer work with my garage door closed. I decided to use 2x2s for the inside support pieces. I had never used wood glue before and at this point I was a bit nervous about how strong it would be, so I wanted something I'd be able to screw into. I spread the glue onto the wood and then used a brad nailer to hold them in place while the glue dried. I did it this way because I didn't have that many clips to use and because I wanted an excuse to use my new brad nailer. I intentionally left out some support pieces during this step because I wanted to attach those later when I had a better sense of how everything would fit. Here is me making another cut without safety glasses. Remember, this is not a tutorial video. It was finally time to begin assembling the unit. Because I didn't want to attach the casters yet, I need to raise the base up a tiny bit with scrap wood during assembly. The fridge has been sitting in direct heat for a while and it was so hot that I actually burned my hand when I touched it. Look at that, it's starting to take shape. I decided that it would be okay if there were visible screws at the bottom of the unit. I really wanted to make sure that the base was strong enough to support the fridge. I pre-drilled holes with a countersinking bit and then attached the walls to the base with screws. The next few cuts were a little bit complicated because the plywood would meet at different angles and I still wasn't entirely sure how I was going to mount the screen. I took my time and tested all of my cuts before attaching anything. I bought a table saw a while ago when it was on sale, but I never actually had a chance to use it. What you are watching here is literally the first time I've ever used a table saw in my life. I found a local company that could cut custom size acrylic. I didn't know the exact dimensions of my marquee yet, so I had them cut it extra big for me. After testing the translucency, I noticed that you could see more of the frame through the acrylic than I had hoped for, so I decided to add some more frame pieces to make it more uniform. I built a box that would sit under the control board. This is where all the wires and electronics would sit once they were installed. Speaking of wires and electronics, look what arrived today. The buttons have LEDs in them and they're supposed to light up when they are connected. I wanted to order these early in the build in case I had to adjust my design to accommodate the size of the buttons. I finally decided how I would mount the screen. I created a wooden bridge that would run from wall to wall of the machine. I attached the VESA mount to the bridge and then screwed the bridge to the walls from the outside. This created more visible screw holes on the outside of the machine, but I accepted that as it was worth it for the added support. With the mount in place, I was finally able to add my final frame pieces to the wall. It's getting dark, so I better call it a day. This was the hardest part of the whole build. I needed to use my jigsaw to cut a square in the back panel to expose the VESA mount. I purchased a proper wood cutting guide, but it kinda sucked and actually made it harder to cut. I did a quick test to make sure the screen was sitting well and to ensure I would have access to all the ports on the back of the PC. Originally, I wanted the screen to be more inset into the cabinet with a wood face surrounding the screen, but with the depth of the walls and the thickness of the VESA mount, I couldn't find any way to make that work, so I opted for more of a floating screen. This next part was fun. I purchased a pair of cheap computer speakers and cracked them open to get the electronics out. I then cut a rectangle and 2 circles into a piece of plywood. The speakers had some ports and a volume knob that I wanted to keep exposed, so I decided to put a control panel in between the 2 speakers. I 3D printed a plate for the control panel and then added a spot for an extra switch, which I would later use to control the light in the marquee. Luckily, I had a big enough piece of wood left over for the button panel. I wanted the panel to extend past the sides of the machine a little bit, so I needed to cut notches for the sides to slide into. This was pretty difficult to do, and I ended up chipping the wood quite a bit. There's probably a better technique for this, but I wasn't aware of it. All in all, I think it came out okay. After attaching the final pieces of wood to the main body, it was time to paint. I attempted to put wood filler into the exposed screw holes, but I don't think it made much of a difference. Most people who I saw do similar projects online use spray paint for their machines, but I don't own the tools to do that, so I decided to paint it all by hand. Once the paint dried, I also added a couple coats of clear varnish. I purposely left the button panel and backing off so far because I want those pieces to be easily removable later. Once everything was painted, I was able to attach my speakers and panel to the cabinet. I was really happy with the way this turned out. Also, the Ryobi Road team gave me this pretty sweet t-shirt to match my tools. Now it was time to screw the holes for the buttons into the button panel. I measured out some guidelines for this process, but mostly I just eyeballed it. The last 2 buttons were supposed to be the easiest, but I rushed it and the holes ended up being slightly off. I'm still a bit mad at myself for not measuring properly, but I don't think anyone would notice if I didn't point it out. Once painted, I installed the buttons and hooked up all of the electronics for the button panel. The instructions for the buttons were incorrect, so I ended up wiring this in a way that caused the LEDs to not light up. Still looks pretty badass. I bought 16 feet of color changing LED strip. I used a glue gun to attach it in a way that would light up the marquee and then wrap it around the frame that the screen sits in so that the light would glow from behind the screen. I even had enough left over to add some glow to the top of the fridge. I should have drilled this hole ahead of time, but I just found a surface mount USB extension cable and I thought it would be really handy to have it exposed on the front of the machine. This came in really handy later when I needed a mouse and keyboard to configure the PC. Time to assemble everything and see how it looks. This next part is boring, it's mostly just me reading config manuals and installing software. But by the end of the night, I was playing Dr. Mario. There were still a few things left to do. I attached the casters to the base and I mounted a power bar inside the machine just to keep everything clean. I also needed to solder the switch for the marquee light, which needed to be done in place because the switch had already been installed into the speaker panel. I still haven't attached the back panel, I should probably do that now. I pre-drilled some screw holes with my countersinking bit, painted it up and screwed it on. I accidentally cut the hole for the power plug on the wrong side, but it's not a big deal. I needed to cut the final top piece last because it sits on an angle and I wanted the other pieces in place to get the angle right. At the last minute, I decided that instead of screwing the panel on directly, I would instead attach it to a hinge so that I could open it up for easy access. I wanted to choose a name that would combine the mini fridge aspect with the arcade machine, so I came up with the name COOLRCADE. It's like COOLRCADE and COOLRCADE. My girlfriend designed me a logo and we cut it onto vinyl transfers using the Cricut machine. It took a lot of patience to get the logo transferred to the marquee. With the new name, I decided to swap out the red buttons for blue buttons, but this time I wired them up correctly. I had a ton of fun with this project and I learned so much during the build. The only thing left to do is crack a beer and get busy setting some high scores. Thanks for watching.